Hi, anatomy students, and welcome to this lecture. This will be on the spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system. And it should be chapters 16 and 18 in your book, but if you have a different version, just be sure that the chapters that you're studying matches up with the information found in this PowerPoint and also in your study guides. Please fill out those study guides. I think they're a great way to help prepare for the exams. And if you ever have questions about how to fill out the study guide, send me an email, come see me on my office hours on Sunday night. I really want to try to help you guys succeed in this course, so please let me know how I can help. So the spinal cord provides a vital link between the brain and the rest of the body. Its attached spinal nerves serve two important functions, a pathway for sensory and motor impulses, and also the spinal nerves are responsible for all of our reflexes, which are our quickest reaction to a stimulus. And the kind of the best reflex I can describe to you right now is the stretch reflex of the patellar tendon. And that's where the doctor hits you with his rubber hammer right below the kneecap to initiate that kicking out or jerking of your quadricep muscle. And that's an example of a reflex. So here's the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. You have a cervical region, a thoracic, a lumbar, a sacral, a coccygeal region. And out of these regions, you'll have pairs of spinal nerves coming off on each side. And you can see those spinal nerves coming off here. And the spinal nerves will be responsible for all sensory and motor input and output from the central nervous system to your peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column that houses it. So your vertebra bones go all the way down to your coccyx, but the spinal cord will end. The tapering inferior end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. This is the official end of the spinal cord proper, and it usually ends around the level of the first lumbar vertebrae. You can see the conus medullaris here. Coming off of that, below the conus medullaris is the cauda equina, and these are all the spinal nerves that are coming off the base of the spinal cord. Inferior to the conus medullaris is what I was just talking about. You have groups of axons called the cauda equina. It literally means horse's tail. They project from the spinal cord, and if you ever get a chance to dissect a cadaver, the spinal cord is one of the coolest things, I think, to look at because the spinal cord is in kind of a protective sheath, and then you can see the cauda equina coming out from the bottom. Within the cauda equina is the filum terminale, which is a thin strand of pia mater that helps anchor the conus medullaris to the coccyx or your tailbone. The spinal cord is associated with 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 8 cervical nerves. They're all named, the nerves are named for the vertebra that they'll come out below. 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and 1 coccygeal nerve. So here's a look at the spinal cord meninges. The spinal cord is protected and encapsulated by the spinal cord meninges, which are connective tissue coverings, which are continuous with the cranial meninges. If you remember from the brain, you have 3 layers around the cerebrum, the pia mater, arachnoid matter, and dura mater. And those 3 meninge layers continue down the spinal cord. The spaces between some of the meninges have clinical significance where there might be fluid surrounding them. So these are the meninge layers that surround the spinal cord and protect it. A sectional anatomy view of the spinal cord, it's partitioned into an area of gray matter and an area of white matter. And again, the white matter contains the myelinated axons because myelin is white. The gray matter contains all of the dendrites and cell bodies of neurons, the unmyelinated axons, and the glial cells. Within the gray matter, we have a posterior horn in the back, the gray commissure around the central canal, the lateral horn and an anterior horn in the front. And then the white matter, we have different funiculi or funiculus for singular. And these funiculus refer to kind of an area of the white matter that contains different tracks or passageways of nerves that travel up and down the spinal cord. You can also see here how the spinal nerve itself separates out into a posterior root and an anterior root. And those are just labeled for which side of the spinal cord they'll enter. The distribution of gray matter, it's centrally located in the spinal cord. It's sectioned in the shape that resembles a butterfly or an H letter. It's subdivided into anterior, lateral, posterior horns, and the gray commissure in the center. The gray matter organization, the dorsal half, which is the posterior part, contains all the sensory roots and ganglia. So this is where all sensory information will enter the spinal cord. The ventral half is the anterior half that contains all the motor roots. So these will be all the motor response to take out to different muscles or glands or target cells. The dorsal and ventral roots will fuse laterally to form all the spinal nerves that come off in pairs at each spinal segment. And there are 4 zones that are evident within the gray matter. There will be a somatic sensory zone, a visceral sensory zone. So somatic sensory comes from all of your muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments. Visceral sensory comes from all of your viscera or organs. The visceral motor will go to all of the motor responses to your viscera or organs, and somatic motor area goes all of to your muscles, bones, and joints. Anterior horns of the gray matter will house all of the somas or cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons, and the lateral horns will contain all cell bodies of the autonomic motor neurons, so the motor neurons that are under subconscious control without you realizing them. They're only found in T1 to L2 parts of the spinal cord. The posterior horns contained axons of all sensory neurons and cell bodies of interneurons. So you'll kind of start to understand that anything going into the posterior side of the spinal cord is all sensory information, and anything coming out of the front, the anterior side, is all motor responses. The dorsal root ganglia found in the posterior root contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. The gray commissure, it's the area in the center that will contain unmyelinated axons and will serve as a communication route between the right and left side. And the gray commissure will house the narrow central canal that contains the cerebral spinal fluid that travels all the way up and is continuous with the ventricles in the brain. Within the gray matter are also functional groups of neuron cell bodies called nuclei. The sensory nuclei in the posterior horn contain interneuron cell bodies of somatic and visceral sensory nuclei. And if it's somatic, it means it's coming from your skeletal muscles, your bones, your joints. If it's visceral sensory nuclei, that's coming from all of your viscera or your organs. The motor nuclei in the anterior horns contain somatic motor nuclei to your skeletal muscles, and the autonomic motor nuclei is everything under subconscious control, and those are located in the lateral horns. The white matter then is external to the gray matter. It's partitioned into 3 different funiculus regions: posterior, lateral, and interior. The anterior funiculi are connected by the white commissure, and the axons with each funiculus are organized into tracts of neurons that will either ascend or descend to and from the brain. A pathway then consists of a tract and a nucleus. A nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies located within the brain or spinal cord, the central nervous system, and each tract may work with multiple nuclei groups in the central nervous system. Ascending pathways will be sensory because they're taking all sensory information from stimuli from the body, whether external or internal, to the brain. And descending paths are motor because they will transmit motor information from the brain to all of your muscles and glands. Over 90% of all pathways will decussate, and decussate just means that they cross over from one side of the body to the other, so that the left side of the brain processes information on the right side of the body and vice versa. So this just means that the left side of the brain, for the most part, controls everything on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls everything on the left side of the body, because these pathways carrying all the sensory and motor information will decussate, cross over, usually in the medulla, sometimes in the spinal cord. Contralateral, if you see that word, that means opposite side, and ipsilateral means the same side. Sensory pathways then are ascending pathways. They conduct information about your limb position, the sensations of touch, temperature, pressure, and pain to the brain. Somatosensory pathways process all stimuli from your skin, your muscles, your joints, and viscerosensory pathways process stimuli received from all of your viscera, which are all of your internal organs. Here are your motor pathways. They're composed of a series of 2 or 3 neurons. The sensory pathways have primary, secondary, and sometimes tertiary neurons. And motor pathways just have upper and lower neurons. And you can kind of see that chart there that describes them. Here's the anterolateral pathway. It's an ascending sensory pathway. It's located in the anterior and lateral white funiculi of the spinal cord. And the pathway is composed of what we call the anterior spinal thalamic tract and the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And these axons, which are in this pathway, will conduct all stimuli related to touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And axons of secondary neurons will cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord before ascending to the brain. And the decussation will occur in the anterior white commissure. So here's a look at the anterolateral pathway, and it's showing how all of the sensory information that comes into the spinal cord, it will cross over in that segment of the spinal cord and then go to the opposite side of the brain. Here are principal sensory spinal cord pathways, locations, functions, and decussation sites. An interesting part to kind of keep in mind is where they decussate or cross over. And that sometimes occurs, it's telling you kind of in the secondary neuron column where they will decussate. Some axons will not decussate, so they'll stay on the same side. Others will decussate in the spinal cord segment or the medulla oblongata. The functional anatomy of a motor pathway then is formed from cerebral nuclei in the brain, the cerebellum, from descending projection tracts and motor neurons. These tracts will regulate all skeletal muscle activity, and the descending projection tracts will all be motor pathways that originate from the cerebral cortex in the brain or the brain stem. And the corticospinal tracts will all descend from your cerebral cortex and form a pair of thick anterior bulges in the medulla oblongata called your pyramids. And axons of the upper motor neurons will synapse or connect with lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And this is showing you where these tracts are located within the white matter. The corticospinal tracts are composed of the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. The axons of the lower motor neurons in the lateral will innervate skeletal muscles, and the axons of the lower motor neurons in the anterior will innervate all of your axial skeletal muscles. So the difference is just the lateral innervates movements in your limbs, and the anterior tracts will innervate more muscles in the trunk of the body. Your lateral corticospinal tracts will include about 85% of the axons of your upper motor neurons. They will decussate within, that means crossing over, within the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, and the upper axons will innervate lower motor neurons of the anterior horn of the spinal cord and interneurons within the spinal cord. So just a key point here is your lateral corticospinal tracts. It's a motor neuron tract. It extends through the medulla oblongata, where the decussation or the crossing over will occur. So here shows the corticospinal tracts, showing a descending tract decussating or crossing over in the medulla oblongata pyramids. So that just means that the left side of the brain will control the right side of the body and vice versa. Then we get to your spinal nerves. There's 31 pairs. They're made up of motor and sensory axons. These are the connective tissue wrappings around the neurons themselves. So you can see here multiple anterior rootlets arise from the spinal cord and merge to form a single anterior root, where my cursor is. Anterior roots only contain motor axons, and posterior or dorsal roots contain the sensory axons. Motor axons arise from cell bodies in the anterior and lateral horns of the spinal cord. Multiple posterior rootlets then are derived from a single posterior root, and posterior root roots only contain sensory axons. Sensory axons will arise from cell bodies in the posterior root ganglion, which is this little bulge you see here, which is attached to the posterior root. Each anterior root and its corresponding posterior root will unite within the intervertebral foramen to become a spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve will then contain both motor and sensory axons. So numbered spinal nerves will be numbered according to the location of the intervertebral canal. In the cervical region, the first 7 pairs of spinal nerves will exit the intervertebral foramen above the vertebra of the same number, and the 8th pair of cervical spinal nerves, the C8, will exit above the first thoracic vertebra, and the remaining pairs of spinal nerves will exit below the vertebra of their same number. So after leaving your intervertebral foramen of the vertebra, a typical spinal nerve splits into branches called rami. The posterior ramus will innervate the deep muscles of the skin in the back, and the anterior ramus will innervate the anterior and lateral portions of the trunk and the upper and lower limbs. Dermatomes is a specific segment of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve, and we've divided dermatomes throughout the body as shown here as kind of a drawing to show where these dermatomes lie on the surface of the skin. All spinal nerves except C1 will innervate a segment of the skin, and the dermatome map follows a segmental pattern along the body. So if you're having pain or touch or cold sensations coming up from a specific dermatome in the body, you can see what spinal nerve is taking up that stimulus. The dermatome map can also be important because anesthesia in a region could indicate potential spinal nerve damage. It's involved also in what we call referred visceral pain, where pain in a dermatome may arise from an organ nowhere near the dermatome. And that's because the same sensory pathways coming from a visceral organ, like your heart, might follow the same sensory nerve pathways from the sensory neurons that are innervating parts of the skin. So this is why in a heart attack, the main kind of thought behind a heart attack is pain will be referred to the left side of the left arm. So that's what we call referred pain. Spinal nerve distribution. The anterior ramus will split into multiple branches, and many of the anterior rami will go on to form nerve plexuses. And additional rami, the rami communicants, and will extend between the spinal nerves and the sympathetic trunk ganglia, which you'll hopefully find out in lab 2. So a nerve plexus, you have several nerve plexuses throughout your body, and a plexus is just a network of interweaving anterior rami of spinal nerves. The anterior rami of most spinal nerves will form nerve plexuses, and plexuses will split into multiple named nerves that will innervate various body structures. The major plexuses will include the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses. And you can see here what nerves will arise from these nerve plexuses and what they will go on to innervate. Tracts then are any sort of ascending information that carry any sort of sensory or motor information, and you guys can kind of read through these kind of review questions as you work through your study guides. As always, if you have any questions on how to review these, come to my office hours or just shoot me an email, but please work through these questions. The autonomic nervous system then works without our awareness, so it's subconscious. The goal of the ANS is to maintain homeostasis, so regularity of your heart rate, your respiratory rate, blood pressure, body temperature, digestion. The visceral sensory division will detect stimuli from all of your blood vessels, internal organs, or viscera, such as the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood or stretch receptors. And the autonomic motor division will send impulses from the CNS, your brain and spinal cord, to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, and glands. So again, anything in the autonomic nervous system is under autonomic or subconscious control. If we compare the two, your somatic nervous system works just with processes that are perceived or controlled consciously, so things that you are aware of. And the autonomic nervous system includes processes that are regulated below the conscious level, so without you being aware of them. Both the CNS and ANS uses sensory and motor neurons. In the SNS, the somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle fibers, causing conscious voluntary movement, and ANS motor neurons will innervate smooth muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers, or glands. And ANS motor neurons can either excite or inhibit cells in the viscera. The motor neurons of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system, you should understand the basic differences of these motor neurons. In the somatic nervous system, you just have a single lower motor neuron axon that extends uninterrupted from the spinal cord to one or more muscle fibers. They will contain large diameter myelinated axons, and they will always release acetylcholine at the synaptic knob. That's the neurotransmitter that's involved with an excitatory effect of your muscles, your skeletal muscles. In your autonomic nervous system, they always use a 2-neuron chain that innervates muscles and glands. The preganglionic neuron has a small diameter. It's always myelinated. It will release acetylcholine at the synaptic knob. And the postganglionic neuron is even smaller diameter, but it will always be unmyelinated, and it can release acetylcholine or norepinephrine. So here's just a look at the lower motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system. The first neuron is the preganglionic neuron, and its cell body is in the brain or spinal cord. The preganglionic axon will extend to the second cell body housed within the autonomic ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. And the second neuron in the pathway is called the postganglionic neuron, and the ganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic axon will extend from its cell body to its effector or target cells. And again, the postganglionic axon will always be unmyelinated, smaller in diameter, so the transmission of the signal is relatively slower compared to your somatic motor axons. And again, this is the autonomic nervous system, so our effectors will be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or other glands. Neurotransmitters. In the sympathetic nervous system, we always release acetylcholine at the ganglion. Then norepinephrine will be released as an excitatory effect. So this is looking at the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of your autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system that often will affect multiple organ systems at the same time, with 3 different pathways to the viscera of the thoracic cavity, to the viscera of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and directly to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands will cause release of hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those are responsible for kind of a stress response. The parasympathetic neurotransmitter will always release acetylcholine from the postganglionic nerve to the effector. It can be excitatory or inhibitory, and it's important to keep in mind that the vagus nerve will always be the major contributor to the parasympathetic nervous system, and the effects of the parasympathetic division are more specific and localized, whereas the sympathetic nervous system could affect multiple organ systems at the same time. So here's a look at different things in the body that the parasympathetic will control versus the sympathetic. And you can kind of pause this lecture at any time to take more time looking at this picture. The parasympathetic division is known as the rest and digest division. So it will conserve your energy, replenish nutrient stores, and maintains homeostasis. We often call it the cranial sacral division because its nerves will come off of the cranial region, as shown here, and the sacral region. Whereas the sympathetic is often known as the thoracolumbar because its nerves will come off the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. The sympathetic division prepares the body for emergencies like the fight or flight response, and also increased alertness and metabolic activity. The sympathetic trunks are located anterior to your spinal nerves and immediately lateral to the vertebral column because they are in the thoracolumbar region. And the sympathetic trunk ganglia will house sympathetic ganglionic neuron cell bodies. One sympathetic ganglion is approximately associated with each spinal nerve. Dual innervation has to do with the effect that many visceral effectors are innervated by postganglionic axons from both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The actions are caused by both divisions. They can be antagonistic or cooperative, meaning they can work against each other or together. And the most prominent is in the digestive tract, your heart, and your lungs. So, for example, sympathetic, the fight or flight response, will decrease digestive motility, and parasympathetic will increase the movement of your gut. Sympathetic activity will increase the heart rate, parasympathetic activity will decrease the heart rate. Sympathetic will increase breathing rate, and parasympathetic will decrease breathing rate. You should have a good understanding of what the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic does. And if you can remember that sympathetic is all fight or flight, and parasympathetic is rest and digest, that'll help you understand what their effects will be on these organ systems. This is a great chart. Take several minutes, maybe an hour to review this chart because it talks about the effects of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions. And just a reminder that these divisions are actually divisions of your autonomic nervous system. So this is all under subconscious control, or things that are happening in your body without you being aware of it. That's the end of this slideshow. As always, feel free to ask me any questions, fill out your study guides, use the Connect resources, but then please ask me questions if you have any. Hope you guys are all doing well.